There is something that happens the first time you put all four resurrection accounts on the same page, not reading one gospel and then the next. Actually placing them side by side, verse by verse, the same morning described four times. And the things you expected to match do not match. Who went to the tomb? The Gospels give different answers. What did they find there? Depends on which one you read. Where did Jesus appear first? Matthew and Luke point to different places in different parts of the country. And the oldest Gospel, the one Matthew and Luke each used as their primary source, ends before the risen Jesus appears to anyone at all. This video is not about whether the resurrection happened. That is a different conversation, and it belongs somewhere else. This video asks a more specific question. When you read these four accounts carefully, side by side, without deciding in advance what you expect to find, what is actually there? 7 tensions. Starting now. The version of the resurrection most people carry is not the version any single gospel tells. It is a composite, a version assembled from all four accounts, selecting the details that sit together most comfortably and quietly, setting aside the ones that do not. Most people who have heard this story their entire lives have received that composite version. They have not been invited to read the four accounts individually, placed against each other, to see what each one actually says on its own terms. The impulse to combine them goes back almost as far as the accounts themselves. In the 2nd century, a scholar named Tatian produced a work called the Diatessaron, weaving all four Gospels into a single continuous narrative. The word means through four. The project was exactly what it sounds like. Take four separate accounts and stitch them into one. That Tatian felt the need to do this in the 2nd century is itself significant. It means the pressure these four accounts create when read together was felt almost immediately. The tension we are about to examine is not a problem discovered by modern critics. It was a problem the tradition knew about and worked to address from the beginning. Harmonization relieves that pressure by constructing a unified story that none of the four individual Gospels actually tells. The question this video returns to across 7 specific cases is not whether harmonization is possible. In some cases, it is. The question is what you have to add to make it work. Because when harmonization requires inserting events or sequences that appear in none of the four Gospels individually, you are no longer reading the Gospels. You are writing a 5th one. Think about what that means in the simplest case. To reconcile the witness lists in the four accounts, harmonization must construct a scene in which multiple groups of women traveled separately to the tomb and arrived at different times, with each gospel recording only a portion of the larger party. That scene appears in no gospel. It exists only in the harmonized version. It is the reader's addition, not the text's. Baruch Spinoza never wrote specifically about the resurrection accounts, but the method he committed to paper in 1670 is the right instrument for what we are about to do. He argued that if you want to understand what a religious text means, you have to ask where it came from, who wrote it, for what community, under what historical pressures. That is not a hostile approach to Scripture. It is the most serious form of attention you can give it. What Spinoza found when he applied that method to the Hebrew Bible was something his community was not prepared to receive. Different texts had different authors. Different authors had different concerns. The document presented as the unified voice of a single divine source was, under careful reading, a collection of voices from different moments and different needs. He did not say those voices were lying. He said they were human. And he paid for that observation with nearly everything he had. The people who have studied the resurrection accounts most carefully have not reached the same conclusions about what the tensions between them mean. Bart Ehrman in Jesus Interrupted argues that the differences reflect 4 writers working for 4 different communities with 4 different theological purposes. N.T. Wright reaches a different conclusion. His work, The Resurrection of the Son of God, argues directly that the differences are what genuine, independent witnesses produce, not coordinated storytellers. Both men engage the same tensions. They reach opposite conclusions. Between those two positions, Raymond E. Brown spent decades working through the resurrection narratives with the care of someone who took their significance and complexity equally seriously. His conclusion was that these accounts cannot be resolved by reading any single one of them in isolation. What all three share is this: the tensions are real. They are significant. Nobody doing serious work on these texts pretends otherwise. That is the only commitment this video makes. 7 moments, starting with the most basic question of all. 4 Gospels describe the same morning, same empty tomb, same stone rolled away. And yet the very first question any historian would ask about an event, who was present to witness it, does not receive the same answer twice. Mark chapter 16 verse 1 names 3 women: Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome, 3 specific people with 3 specific names. Matthew 28 verse 1 names 2: Mary Magdalene and the other Mary. Salome is gone. No explanation is given. Luke 24 verse 10 gives a different list entirely. Mary Magdalene is there. Joanna appears, a name absent from Mark's account. Mary the mother of James returns. Then Luke adds a phrase that opens the list outward without closing it: the others with them, a group the narrative does not name and does not count. John chapter 20 verse 1 names 1 person. Mary Magdalene arrives before dawn alone and finds the stone already removed. 4 accounts. 4 different answers to the question of who was present at the foundational scene of the entire Christian tradition. Before going further, there is a historical detail that sharpens the significance of this disagreement. In many ancient Jewish and Greco-Roman legal and social contexts, women's testimony could be treated with skepticism, particularly in formal public settings. This is one reason many historians who argue for the historical reliability of the empty tomb tradition point to the women witnesses as a potentially early and authentic feature of the accounts. A writer constructing a story for maximum persuasive impact in that cultural context would have had reasons to choose male witnesses instead. All 4 Gospels independently place women at the center of the foundational scene. That unanimity is historically striking. And yet, despite that shared foundation, the 4 accounts cannot agree on which women or how many. Now, there is a detail in John's account worth handling carefully. John 20 verse 2 records what Mary says after she discovers the stone removed. They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him. We, not I. Mary arrives alone in John's narrative, but the word she uses when reporting what happened is plural. Some scholars read this as evidence that John assumes a group of women, even though the narrative focuses on Mary alone. Others read it as a trace of an earlier tradition where multiple women were present, partially absorbed into a more concentrated telling. John preserves the tension inside the report itself. The text does not resolve it. The word is simply there. Now look at what the specific witness lists tell us about each gospel's theological concerns. Mark's 3 named women appear earlier in his gospel as figures who followed Jesus from Galilee, served him during his ministry, watched the crucifixion from a distance when the male disciples had fled, and watched where the body was laid so they would know where to return. Their presence at the tomb continues a narrative thread Mark has been developing. Luke adds Joanna, who appears earlier in Luke 8 as one of the women who traveled with Jesus from Galilee and supported his ministry. Her presence connects the resurrection to the broader community Luke has been describing. John focuses entirely on Mary Magdalene, who in John's gospel has a more developed relationship with Jesus than in any other account. Each choice is internally coherent within its own gospel. Each choice is different from the others. Here is what makes this disagreement genuinely interesting rather than simply problematic. If the resurrection tradition had been centrally coordinated by a single group, the witness lists would almost certainly have been aligned before the texts reached their final form. The fact that 4 communities each preserved a different list with different names and different numbers suggests the tradition grew organically across communities that were not in close enough contact to harmonize these details. In other words, the disagreement between the lists may itself be evidence of something about how the tradition actually spread. Independent communities, each holding their own version of the memory, each writing it down without checking against the others. That does not tell us what happened at the tomb. It tells us something about how the memory of that morning traveled through the first century. The names of the first witnesses are not a peripheral detail. For a tradition built around the significance of eyewitness testimony, they are exactly the kind of detail that matters. The fact that four accounts of the same morning cannot settle who was present, and that one of those accounts carries an unresolved tension within a single verse, is not easy to set aside. The harmonization response is that different women traveled in groups, arriving at different times, with each gospel focusing on different members of a larger party. That reading is coherent in principle, but it requires constructing a scene that none of the four gospels describes. The unified arrival in waves exists only in the composite version, not in any individual text. And that is only the question of who arrived. What they found when they got there is a different problem entirely.